The thunder of the gunshot was a physical blow, a concussive force that slammed through the sleepy afternoon air of Redemption Creek. Glass erupted from the bank's front window, showering the dusty street in a crystalline explosion. Inside, Hollis dropped to one knee behind an overturned mahogany desk, the acrid smell of gunpowder searing his nostrils. He was supposed to be depositing a small pouch of earnings, a simple errand in a town he rarely visited. And now he was caught in the heart of a maelstrom. 3 men moved with the fluid, brutal economy of wolves. 2 were covering the doors, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, their shotguns held with a lazy confidence that spoke of long practice. But it was the 3rd man, and the leader, who commanded the room. He stood in the center of the floor, unmasked, his gaze sweeping over the terrified clerk and the few customers huddled against the far wall. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat that fit too well for a common outlaw, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky, cold, intelligent, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Silence," he said, his voice not loud, but carrying a chilling authority that cut through the whimpers of fear. "Cooperation will be rewarded with your continued existence. Resistance will be corrected." He gestured with a silver-plated Colt toward the vault. "Mr. Abernathy, you have 30 seconds to open that door before I ask your assistant to count the floorboards with his teeth." The bank manager, a portly man with sweat beading on his bald scalp, stumbled forward, fumbling with a ring of keys. Hollis remained perfectly still, his body coiled with a tension he hadn't felt in a decade. His instincts, long dormant, screamed at him. He cataloged exits, counted threats, assessed the angles. His own pistol was holstered at his hip, a relic of a former life. But drawing it now would be suicide. He was 1 man against 3, and the leader, he could already tell, was not a man who made mistakes. As the leader, Silas Kane, as Hollis would later learn, he was called, turned to watch the manager's trembling hands at the vault. Something on his vest caught the light slanting through the shattered window. It was a glint of silver, intricate and familiar. Hollis's breath caught in his throat. Hanging from a leather cord against the dark fabric of Kane's vest was a locket. It was oval-shaped, etched with the delicate design of a climbing rose, a single tiny pearl embedded in its clasp. Hollis's world tilted. The sounds of the robbery, the frantic scratching of keys, the heavy breathing of the hostages faded into a dull roar. That locket? It was identical to the one his partner, U.S. Marshal Daniel Crawford, had given to his wife Eleanor on their 5th anniversary. Hollis had been there, had shared a bottle of whiskey with Daniel that night as he'd practiced what he would say. He remembered the weight of it in his own palm, the cool press of silver, the impossibly small pearl. He had last seen it around Eleanor's neck just hours before the fire. The fire that had claimed them all, Daniel, Eleanor, and the outlaw they'd cornered in that abandoned warehouse. A fire Hollis had survived, but a part of him had died in nonetheless. Now a ghost of that night was here, hanging from the chest of a ruthless bank robber. The robbery ceased to be a random act of violence. It became a question, an accusation, a shard of his past thrust into the heart of his present. The man named Silas Kane wasn't just a thief. He was a phantom, and his presence in Redemption Creek was a desecration of a grave Hollis had spent 10 years digging for his own soul. The vault door groaned open, and Silas's men began hauling out canvas bags. Hollis didn't move. He watched the locket swing with the man's movements, a pendulum marking the collision of 2 worlds that he had fought desperately to keep apart. For him, the robbery was over. A hunt had just begun. The ride back to his ranch was a journey through a landscape of memory. The familiar creak of his saddle, the rhythmic plod of his horse's hooves on the dry earth, sounds that usually soothed him, were now a grating percussion against the roaring silence in his mind. The silver locket burned behind his eyes, a phantom image superimposed over the rolling hills and sparse mesquite. He urged his horse faster, the need for the stark, unforgiving solitude of his home, a physical ache. His ranch was less a home than a fortress against the past, built by his own hands in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains. The cabin was small, fashioned from rough-hewn pine, with a porch that overlooked a vast, empty expanse of prairie. It was a place of self-imposed exile, a penance paid in silence and hard labor. For 10 years he had risen with the sun and worked until his muscles screamed, burying his thoughts under the weight of physical exhaustion. He had sought a quiet so profound it might deafen the ghosts that whispered his name. Dismounting, he didn't bother to unsaddle his horse, leaving it to stand at the trough as he pushed open the cabin door. The interior was spare and immaculate. A single cot, a stone hearth, a table with one chair. Every object had its place, a small attempt to impose order on a life that had spun out of control one fiery night a decade ago. He strode to the hearth and stared into the cold ashes, but all he saw were flames. The official report had called it a tragic accident. They had tracked the notorious gunslinger Marcus Blackwood to a derelict warehouse on the edge of the territory. The plan had been simple. Hollis would cover the back, while Daniel went in the front. But something had gone wrong. A stray lantern, a spilled oil drum, the story changed with who told it. The warehouse had gone up like a tinderbox. By the time Hollis had broken through a boarded-up window, the smoke was a suffocating monster. He'd found Daniel's body near the entrance, fallen beside Blackwood's. Eleanor, who had inexplicably followed them, was deeper inside, lost to the inferno. Hollis had dragged his partner's body out, his own lungs, scorched, his hands burned, but he had been too late for her. He had failed them all. The guilt was a brand on his soul, the reason he'd turned in his marshal's star and vanished into the anonymity of this land. Now that carefully constructed peace was shattered. Silas Kane and that locket. It couldn't be a coincidence. Thieves might steal jewelry, but a piece that specific, worn so openly, it felt like a message. The next day, he rode into Redemption Creek, the town he usually avoided. The bank was boarded up, a testament to yesterday's violence. The air was thick with nervous energy and whispered speculation. He bypassed the saloon and headed for the general store, a place that served as the town's beating heart. Martha, the owner, stood behind the counter, her kind face etched with worry. She was a woman in her late 50s with flour dust on her apron and a wisdom in her eyes that saw more than most. "Hollis," she said, her voice warm but subdued. "Didn't expect to see you so soon. Terrible business at the bank." He nodded, leaning against the counter. "Heard anything who they were?" "A new gang, they say. Calling themselves the Kane Gang. Sheriff Bartlett's run ragged trying to pick up a trail. They moved like smoke," he said. "Clean, professional, not like the usual riffraff." She lowered her voice. "They say the leader, this Silas Kane, he's different. Educated, speaks like a gentleman from back east. Odd for a bank robber." Hollis's jaw tightened. An educated man. A precise man. A man who wore a dead woman's locket. "Sheriff got any leads?" "None to speak of," Martha said, shaking her head. "It's like they appeared out of thin air and vanished back into it. Left the whole town spooked." She eyed him carefully. "You were inside, weren't you? I heard you were. You look like a man who's seen a ghost." He didn't answer, instead buying a sack of grain. He didn't need the transaction, a thin cover for his questions. As he was leaving, Sheriff Bartlett entered. The sheriff was a man weathered by the sun and the thankless job of policing a territory too wide to tame. His face was a roadmap of exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp. Hollis Bartlett grunted a weary acknowledgement. He respected Hollis's past as a marshal, but had long ago stopped trying to pry into the reasons for his retirement. "Heard you were a witness." "I was there," Hollis confirmed, his tone clipped. "See anything useful? Anything at all?" Hollis thought of the locket. To mention it would be to exhume a body he had buried deep. It would invite questions he wasn't ready to answer, drag him back into a world of law and death he had sworn to forsake. They were professionals, he said, echoing Martha's words. Leader knew what he was doing. That's all. Bartlett sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. That's what everyone says. Doesn't help me find them. He looked at Hollis, a flicker of the old camaraderie in his eyes. You ever miss it, the hunt? No, Hollis lied the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. He turned and walked out, the weight of his deception settling heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't trust the law with this. This ghost was his to hunt. The sight of the locket hadn't just dredged up old memories. It had given his guilt a new and terrible purpose. Days bled into a week, each one a torment of unanswered questions. Hollis worked his land with a frantic energy, trying to sweat out the poison of the past, but it was no use. At night, he'd sit by the fire, cleaning his colt, the familiar ritual, a cold comfort. The locket was a key, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it unlocked a door he should have never closed. The question was no longer whether he would re-engage with the world he'd left behind, but when. The answer came on a blistering afternoon, not as a choice, but as a reckoning. He was riding the southern edge of his property, checking a fence line near a dry arroyo, when he saw the buzzards circling. Their dark shapes spiraled against the merciless blue sky, a grim omen. A slow unease coiled in his gut as he nudged his horse forward. Down in the rocky wash, shielded from the sun by a meager overhang, was a crumpled figure. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. It was a woman, her dress torn and stained with dirt and dried blood. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her face was bruised, her lips cracked and swollen. As he knelt beside her, his gaze fell upon her shoulder, where the fabric of her dress had been ripped away. Seared into her skin, a fresh wound, angry and red, was a brand. It was a simple, stark design, a stylized letter, K, entwined with a serpent. Cain. The world narrowed to that single vicious mark. This wasn't a random victim of the trail. She was connected to Silas Cain. Hollis's hands went still. He could ride away. Leave her for the buzzards, for the law. To help her would be to invite the devil to his doorstep. It would mean declaring war on a man he knew nothing about, save that he wore a dead woman's locket and branded his enemies like cattle. He looked at her face, young and etched with a suffering that seemed too vast for her slender frame. A faint, almost inaudible moan escaped her lips. In that sound he heard an echo of his own buried pain. He had spent 10 years running from the ghosts of those he couldn't save. Leaving another soul to perish in the dust felt like the final, unforgivable betrayal. With a muttered curse, he gently gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. As he lifted her, he made a choice. He was no longer just a man haunted by a memory. He was now sheltering an enemy of the ruthless phantom who wore it. His exile was over. He had just invited the past, in all its violent glory, to come knocking at his door. He carried her back to the cabin, her unconscious form, a testament to the brutality of the world he had tried to shun. Laying her on his cot, he worked with a gentle efficiency born of long-forgotten training. He cleaned her wounds, stitched a deep gash on her arm, and applied a cool cloth to her feverish brow. The brand on her shoulder was a testament to calculated cruelty, a mark of ownership and discard. He covered it with a clean bandage, his touch careful, his jaw set like granite. She drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. In her delirium, she murmured fragmented words, a name, Abel, a place, the crossing, and pleas to be left alone. Hollis sat by the hearth, a silent sentinel, his shotgun resting across his knees. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a guardian. Every creak of the floorboards, every howl of the wind outside, was the sound of approaching danger. He had to keep her hidden not just from Silas Kane's men who were surely hunting for their escaped property, but from Sheriff Bartlett as well. The sheriff was a good man, but he was the law. He would have to take her into custody, ask questions, and her presence in Redemption Creek's jail would be a public announcement to Kane. Here in this isolated cabin, she had a chance. On the third morning, her eyes opened, and for the first time they were clear. They were the color of moss, shadowed with a terror so profound it seemed to suck the light from the room. She flinched when she saw him scrambling back against the headboard, until a gasp of pain from her shoulder stopped her. Easy Hollis set his voice a low rumble. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. He set a cup of water on the small table beside the cot, then retreated to the other side of the room, giving her space. She watched him, her gaze darting around the spare cabin like a trapped animal searching for an escape. Her name was Winona. The word came out as a dry rasp, a piece of information offered up like a shield. Hollis, he replied simply. For a long while, that was the only exchange. He tended the fire, his back to her, creating a deliberate pocket of privacy. He could feel her watching his every move, weighing, judging. He knew trust was a currency she couldn't afford to spend lightly. He wouldn't ask for it. He would have to earn it moment by silent moment. Later that day, he ladled some broth into a bowl and left it on the table. He didn't watch to see if she ate, but when he returned from checking on his horses, the bowl was empty. It was a start. Their conversations began in fragments, clipped and fearful on her part. She refused to speak of the gang or how she came to be with them. Instead, she asked about the ranch, the horses, the mountains in the distance. Each question was a test, a small stone dropped into the well of his silence to see how deep it went. He answered her plainly, his words sparse but direct. He showed her how he mended a saddle, the patient, repetitive motion of needle and awl, a lesson in itself. He sat on the porch in the evenings, cleaning his guns, the quiet clicks of metal on metal, a strange sort of lullaby. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Here you are, protected. One evening, as a cool breeze whispered through the open doorway, she finally spoke of them. They were looking for her. She whispered, her voice barely audible. The one who got away. Hollis stopped polishing the barrel of his rifle. Who? I don't know her name. They never said it. But Silas, he was obsessed. He said she had something of his, something he needed back. A cold dread trickled down Hollis's spine. It couldn't be a coincidence. Did they say what it was? Winona shook her head, pulling her blanket tighter. Just that it was important. That it would lead him to what he was truly looking for. He wasn't just a thief, Hollis. He was a hunter. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a picture he did not want to see. Silas wasn't just on a robbing spree. He was on a quest, and Winona was a casualty of it. By saving her, Hollis had stepped directly into the path of that hunt. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a name and a purpose, and it was drawing nearer with every passing day. His quiet ranch had become the most dangerous place in the territory. Hollis knew he couldn't remain hidden forever. He needed information, and the only way to get it was to return to the world he had renounced. Leaving Winona with a loaded rifle and strict instructions not to open the door for anyone, he rode out under the cover of a moonless night. His destination wasn't Redemption Creek, but the sites of 2 other robberies that had occurred in the territory over the last month, a stagecoach holdup near Dusty Devil's Gap, and a payroll snatch from a mining camp in the foothills. Sheriff Bartlett saw them as random acts of a brazen new gang. Hollis suspected they were something more. He moved like a phantom, his old skills returning with a grim familiarity. At Devil's Gap, where the stagecoach had been ambushed, he found what Bartlett's posse had missed. Tucked beneath a rock almost completely buried was a casing from a rifle. It wasn't the common Spencer or Henry round. It was a Sharps 50-90, a big game cartridge favored by buffalo hunters and Army sharpshooters. It bespoke a shooter with a preference for distance and precision. Silas Kane's work. At the mining camp, he spoke to a shaken paymaster who described the gang's leader. He wasn't interested in the company payroll, not really the man. Stammered, his eyes still wide with fear. He held a map, kept asking about old survey lines, about a lawman who used to patrol this area years back. Said the man's name was Crawford. Daniel Crawford. Hollis's blood ran cold. This wasn't a search for a person or an object. Silas was mapping Daniel's old patrol routes, tracing the footsteps of a dead man. The robberies were a pretense, a way to gather funds and sow terror while conducting a meticulous, almost historical investigation. But why? Back at the cabin, he found Winona awake, her face pale in the lamplight. As he shared his findings, a flicker of recognition crossed her face. A map, she breathed. Silas had one. He was always studying it, marking it. He asked me once if I knew anything about the fire at the old Tanner warehouse, the one that killed a marshal 10 years ago. Her story, once fragmented, began to pour out of her. Her brother Abel, a weak man drowning in debt, had sold her to Silas in exchange for his life. Silas had taken her not for pleasure, but because she had grown up in the region. He used her as a guide, a source of local knowledge, pressing her for details about old landmarks, forgotten trails, and the men who had once enforced the law there. He wasn't like the others, she said, her voice trembling. The rest of his men were animals, but Silas, he was different. He would read books by the firelight. He spoke of history, of justice, of debts that must be paid in blood. He was hunting for a ghost, and he believed this land held the key. She looked at Hollis, her eyes searching his. He asked about Daniel Crawford's partner, too, the one who survived. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with the unsaid. He was the surviving partner. He was the ghost Silas was hunting. The inevitable confrontation came sooner than he expected. They needed supplies, a risk they could no longer avoid. In Redemption Creek, the atmosphere was different. The fear had curdled into suspicion. As they loaded their wagon outside Martha's store, a man stepped out of the saloon. He was lanky with a mean ferret-like face, and his eyes locked onto Winona with instant recognition. Hollis had seen him before, one of the riders who scouted for Silas. "Well, look what the cat dragged in." And the man drawled his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. He took a deliberate step toward Winona. "Kane's been looking for you, girl. Got a reward out for your return. Says you ran off with something that wasn't yours." Winona froze, her face draining of all color. The townsfolk on the street stopped, their curiosity piqued. "She's with me." Hollis said, his voice low and flat. He didn't move, didn't reach for his gun. He simply stood between the scout and Winona, a human wall. The scout sneered. "Playing the hero, old man. You don't know who you're messing with. Silas Kane ain't a man who forgets, and he ain't a man who forgives." He spat on the ground near Hollis's boots. "That little runaway is his property. He'll come for her, and he'll tear down anyone standing in his way." Hollis's gaze was like chips of ice. "Tell your boss if he wants her, he knows where to find me." It was a declaration of war made in the middle of Main Street. The scout's eyes widened slightly, taken aback by the direct challenge. He held Hollis's gaze for a moment longer, then gave a short, ugly laugh and swaggered back into the saloon. The encounter was over, but the message had been sent. Hollis was no longer hiding. He had publicly claimed Winona, and in doing so had painted a target on his own back. On the ride home, Winona was silent, her hands clenched in her lap. As they reached the turnoff to the ranch, she finally spoke, her voice thick with a mixture of fear and awe. "No one has ever done that for me before. No one has ever stood for me." "He was going to find us eventually," Hollis said gruffly, his eyes on the road. "Better we choose the ground." But he knew it was more than that. In that moment, on that dusty street, he hadn't just been protecting a woman he'd rescued. He'd been defending his own chance at redemption. The bond between them, forged in silence and shared danger, had solidified into something fierce and unyielding. He was no longer just her protector. She was his purpose. And as the sun set, casting long, bloody shadows across the plains, Hollis knew the hunt was coming to him. He could only prepare for the storm. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in the one place Hollis had avoided for years, the territorial archives, a dusty, neglected office in the county seat, a full day's ride from his ranch. He left Winona barricaded in the cabin, a knot of dread tight in his chest. He was moving toward a truth he suspected would be uglier than any lie. Posing as a historian researching old land grants, he gained access to the records. He spent hours poring over faded documents, the brittle paper smelling of time and decay. He found the file on the Tanner warehouse fire. It was thin, the investigation cursory. Accidental fire. 3 deceased U.S. Marshal Daniel Crawford, his wife Eleanor, and wanted fugitive Marcus Blackwood. Case closed. But Hollis kept digging. He pulled the property records for the Blackwood family, a name he had tried to forget. Marcus Blackwood had been a rancher before he turned outlaw, a man who'd lost his land to the railroad. And there, listed on a dusty deed from 20 years prior, was the name of his only son, Ethan Blackwood. The name meant nothing to him. Frustrated, Hollis turned to the arrest warrants from that era. He found the warrant for Marcus Blackwood. Stapled to it was a grainy photograph, a formal portrait of the outlaw, taken years before his fall from grace. He stood beside his wife and a young boy of about 10. The boy was dressed in a stiff suit, his dark hair slicked back, but it was his eyes that made Hollis's breath catch. They were cold, intelligent, and piercingly pale, even in the faded photograph. They were the eyes of Silas Kane, Silas Kane was Ethan Blackwood, the son of the man who had died in the fire. The revelation hit Hollis like a physical blow. He stumbled back from the table, his mind reeling the pieces of the last few weeks, slotting together with horrifying clarity. This was never about money or maps. This was a vendetta. Ethan Blackwood had returned not as a common outlaw, but as an avenging angel of his own making. He believed Hollis was responsible for his father's death, for the ruin of his family. The locket wasn't a trophy. It was a relic, a symbol of everything he'd lost. The robberies, the mapping of Daniel's roots, the questions about the fire. It was all a meticulous, cold-blooded campaign to reconstruct the past in order to destroy the man he blamed for it. To destroy Hollis. The world outside the dusty office seemed unreal as Hollis rode home. The sun beat down, but he felt a chill deep in his bones. He was not being hunted by a stranger. He was being stalked by a consequence of his greatest failure. He had spent a decade punishing himself for the fire, and now the son of one of its victims had come to mete out his own brand of justice. When he reached the ranch, he told Winona everything. He watched her face as the story unfolded, saw the fear in her eyes harden into resolve. She did not shrink from the truth. Instead, she placed her hand on his arm, a simple gesture of solidarity that anchored him in the swirling chaos of his thoughts. "You are not the man he thinks you are." "Hollis," she said softly, "we will face him together." Ethan Blackwood, now fully unmasked in Hollis's mind, did not wait long to escalate his campaign. He was a strategist, and he knew a direct assault on the ranch would be too simple, too clean. He wanted to dismantle Hollis's life first, to strip him of his name and turn him into the villain Ethan believed him to be. The attack came insidiously. One morning, a neighboring rancher rode up to Hollis's property, his face a mask of fury, accusing Hollis of rustling a dozen head of his cattle. Hollis denied it, but the rancher pointed to the tracks leading directly from his broken fence to Hollis's land. The tracks were from a horse with a distinctive chipped shoe, Hollis's own mare. Someone had stolen his horse in the night, used it for the crime, and returned it before dawn. It was a perfect frame. Sheriff Bartlett arrived later that day, his expression grim. "I don't want to believe it, Hollis, but the evidence is damning. Half the valley is in an uproar." "It's a setup," Bartlett. Hollis argued, his voice tight with frustration. "It's Kane. You keep saying his name, but no one's seen him." The sheriff countered his weariness, warring with his duty. "All I have are cattle tracks leading to your door and a witness who says he saw your horse near the fence line last night. I have to issue a warrant. You need to come with me." Hollis looked at the warrant in Bartlett's hand, then at Winona, who stood just inside the cabin door, her face pale. If he went to jail, he'd be a sitting duck, and Winona would be left alone, defenseless. He made his decision in a heartbeat. "I'm not going." Bartlett's hand dropped to his pistol. "Don't make me do this, Hollis. You're a good man, Sheriff, but you're walking into a trap you can't see." Hollis said, his voice dropping. "I'm not your enemy." Before Bartlett could react, Hollis kicked over a nearby rain barrel, sending a cascade of water toward the sheriff. In that split second of confusion, Hollis vaulted onto his horse, pulling Winona up behind him. They galloped away from the ranch, the sheriff's shouts of "Hollis, damn you," stop echoing behind them. They were fugitives, hunted by both the law and the outlaws. They rode hard for the high country, making for a hidden line cabin Hollis knew from his marshal days. They were isolated, cut off with only each other to rely on. The community he had held at arm's length for a decade had now fully turned against him, convinced by Ethan Blackwood's masterful manipulation. They had been holed up in the mountains for 3 days when the final message came. It was delivered by a frightened boy from Redemption Creek, who'd been paid a silver dollar to ride up and leave a note pinned to a tree. The message was brief and written in a precise, elegant script. "I have something of yours. The boy from the general store. If you want to see him alive again, come to the old mission church at sundown. Come alone. The debt is due. Martha's son." Ethan had kidnapped Martha's son, a boy of 15, named Jacob. He had attacked not Hollis, but the heart of the community, the one person who had always shown Hollis a measure of kindness. It was a move of breathtaking cruelty, designed to force Hollis out of hiding and into a confrontation on Ethan's chosen ground. The choice was gone. Hollis had to go. "It's a trap," Winona said, her voice taut with fear. "He'll kill you." "He'll kill the boy if I don't go," Hollis countered, checking the loads in his Colt. "This ends tonight, one way or another." "Then I'm going with you," she stated, her chin set in a stubborn line. "I know their tactics. I know how they move. You said we'd face him together." He looked at her, at the fierce loyalty shining in her eyes, and knew he couldn't argue. He was no longer a man alone. His fight was her fight now. As a storm gathered over the mountains, its dark clouds mirroring the turmoil in his soul, they rode down toward the abandoned church, toward a final bloody reckoning with the past. The abandoned Mission San Diablo stood like a skeleton against the bruised twilight sky. Rain began to fall, thick, heavy drops that drummed against the crumbling adobe walls and turned the dust to mud. A thunderstorm was breaking, and with each flash of lightning, the church's bell tower was illuminated, a crooked finger pointing toward a wrathful heaven. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of damp earth and decay. Light from a few strategically placed lanterns cast long dancing shadows, making the cavernous space feel both immense and claustrophobic. In the center of the nave, tied to a chair before the ruined altar, was Martha's son Jacob, his eyes wide with terror. Standing beside him, calmly inspecting the action on his silver-plated colt, was Ethan Blackwood. He looked up as Hollis and Winona slipped through a side entrance, their boots silent on the stone floor. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. The surviving partner, Ethan, said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "I knew you would come. A man can't outrun his own guilt." "Let the boy go," Ethan Hollis said, his voice steady despite the frantic beating of his heart. He and Winona had taken positions on opposite sides of the room, using the crumbling pews as cover. "Your fight is with me." Ethan laughed, a sound utterly devoid of warmth. "My fight is with the memory of what you did. This boy, this town, they are merely the scenery for our final act. You took my father from me. You burned my life to the ground. An eye for an eye, Marshal." A peal of thunder shook the church, and the wind howled through the broken stained glass windows. "The fire was an accident," Hollis said, his voice raw. "I tried to save them, all of them." "A convenient story," Ethan sneered. He cocked his pistol and pressed the barrel to Jacob's temple. The boy whimpered, tears streaming down his face. "But the truth has a way of rising from the ashes. I spent 10 years searching for it. And I learned things. Wonderful, terrible things." He began to pace before the altar, his movements charged with a manic energy. "My father, Marcus Blackwood, was a criminal. I don't deny that. But he wasn't working alone. He had a partner, a man of the law, who fed him information, who took a share of the profits. A man who got greedy." Hollis stared, confusion warring with dread. What was he talking about? "You see," Ethan continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "the fire wasn't an accident. And you weren't the only Marshal there that night who had a secret. Your partner, the heroic Daniel Crawford, he was corrupt." The word struck Hollis with the force of a physical blow. "You're lying." "Am I?" Ethan's smile was predatory. "Daniel was my father's partner. He decided my father knew too much, that he was becoming a liability. So he arranged a meeting at that warehouse. He set the fire himself to silence my father and cover his tracks. But he made a mistake. His wife Eleanor followed him. She must have suspected something. She saw what he did." Ethan paused, letting the horror of his words sink in. "So Daniel killed her too. He made it look like she was caught in the blaze he set. He faked his own death, dragging some poor vagrant's body into the flames to be identified as his own. And then he simply vanished. With all the money." The foundation of Hollis's world crumbled. The guilt he had carried for a decade, it was a lie. The man he had mourned as a brother, a hero, was a monster. Daniel was alive. His only mistake, Ethan said, his voice trembling with a rage that had festered for years, was that you survived. The one loose end. He wrote to me years later from a new life in Mexico. A letter of confession of sorts. He told me you were the one to blame. That you had discovered his secret and set the fire to expose him. He turned my grief into a weapon and aimed it squarely at you. Ethan's face contorted, the cold composure cracking to reveal the broken boy beneath. My entire life, this entire vendetta, it was all based on his lie. I've been hunting the wrong man. The revelation shattered him. His purpose, his righteous fury, it all evaporated, leaving only a hollow, echoing void. In that moment of stunned silence, Winona acted. Drawing on the knowledge she'd gleaned from her time with the gang, she knew they always had a sharpshooter providing overwatch. She scanned the shadowy choir loft and saw him a glint of a rifle barrel in the darkness. She threw a loose stone against the far wall. The sharp clatter drew the sniper's attention for a fraction of a second. It was all Hollis needed. He fired not at Ethan, but at the chain holding a heavy iron chandelier above the altar. The chain snapped, and the massive fixture crashed down, missing Ethan and Jacob, but plunging their side of the church into near total darkness as it smashed the lanterns. The gunfight erupted into a chaotic, desperate struggle fought in flashes of lightning and muzzle flares. It wasn't a heroic duel. It was a gritty, terrifying scramble for survival. Winona fired toward the choir loft, suppressing the sniper while Hollis moved to free Jacob. Ethan, disoriented and consumed by his broken reality, fired wildly into the shadows. Hollis cut the boy loose, shoving him toward the side exit. Go, get out of here. He turned back just as Ethan lunged at him from the darkness. They crashed to the floor, grappling for control of Ethan's pistol. It was a brutal close-quarters fight driven by a decade of pain and misunderstanding. The gun went off, the shot deafeningly loud, and Ethan's body went limp. He collapsed on top of Hollis, a look of shocked, agonizing clarity in his eyes. He had been killed not by Hollis's bullet, but by his own, a final tragic casualty of Daniel's decade-old betrayal. As silence fell, broken only by the sound of the rain, and Winona's hurried footsteps approaching Hollis lay on the cold stone floor, the weight of the dead man on his chest, staring up into the darkness of the church he had entered to confront a ghost, only to find a far more terrible truth. Sheriff Bartlett and his posse arrived just as the storm began to break, drawn by the sound of gunfire reported by a terrified Jacob. They found Hollis sitting on the church steps, the rain washing the grime and blood from his face, with Winona standing a silent vigil beside him. Inside the church, the scene told a grim story. On Ethan Blackwood's body, tucked into an inner pocket of his coat, Bartlett found a worn, creased letter. It was from Daniel Crawford, postmarked from a town in Mexico, filled with the venomous lies that had fueled a son's misplaced revenge, and in doing so confirmed every word of Ethan's final shocking confession. Hollis's name was cleared. The news of Daniel's corruption and survival spread through Redemption Creek like a prairie fire, transforming Hollis from a fugitive into a tragic figure, a man wronged by his closest friend. The townspeople who had so recently scorned him now looked at him with a mixture of awe and pity. They saw him save Martha's son, saw him face down the Kane gang, and their judgment gave way to respect. They saw Winona not as damaged goods, but as a woman of courage who had stood by his side. A few days later, a federal marshal brought Winona's brother Abel back to town in shackles. He had been found in a saloon 2 counties over, bragging about his connection to the infamous Silas Kane. Winona faced him not in the street, but in the sheriff's office. She didn't need to raise her voice. She simply looked him in the eye, her gaze steady and unbroken, and told him she would testify against him. Her quiet strength was more damning than any shouted accusation. Watching the law lead him away, she felt the last of her old chains fall away. She was not a victim seeking revenge, but a survivor demanding justice. The world settled. The noise and violence receded, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of life. Hollis and Winona returned to the ranch, their shared ordeal having forged a bond deeper than words. The silence that had once defined their existence was no longer a sign of distance, but of a profound and peaceful understanding. Several months passed. The harshness of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The ranch began to feel less like a fortress and more like a home. Hollis repaired the fences, his movements sure and steady. Winona planted a small garden near the porch, her hands once trembling with fear, now coaxing life from the stubborn soil. They worked together, side by side, their comfortable silence, a partnership that needed no declaration. One crisp morning, Hollis took the silver locket recovered from Ethan's vest and rode out to the small cemetery on the edge of town. He stopped before the simple granite headstone that read, Daniel Crawford, loyal partner, fallen hero. The words were a bitter irony, a monument to a lie. He knelt in the tall grass, the cool metal of the locket resting in his palm. For a decade, his guilt over Daniel's death had been his constant companion. Now he felt only the hollow ache of betrayal. He didn't open the locket. He didn't need to see the faded image of Eleanor's smiling face. Instead, he dug a small hole in the earth at the base of the headstone and placed the locket inside. As he covered it with soil, he wasn't just burying a piece of silver. He was burying the ghost that had haunted him for 10 years. He was letting go of the guilt, the anger, the complicated, ugly truth of the past. He stood dusting the dirt from his hands and looked out at the horizon. For the first time, it didn't seem like an ending, but a beginning. He turned his horse and rode back toward the ranch. As he topped the final rise, he saw her. Winona was waiting on the porch, her silhouette framed against the warm light of the cabin. She raised a hand in greeting, a small, simple gesture that spoke of welcome, of home. He rode toward her, toward the future they were building together from the ashes of their broken pasts. They stood together, looking out at the vast, open land, not as two broken people clinging to each other for survival, but as two whole individuals choosing to face the rising sun.